Before they went over the top, many of them wrote a letter, not because they wanted to, but because they understood something most people never have to face, that they might not come back. During World War I, millions of soldiers lived in conditions that are almost impossible to imagine today. Mud-filled trenches, constant artillery fire, disease, and the ever-present threat of death. And in the middle of all that chaos, they wrote. According to preserved documents from the National Archives, letters were one of the only lifelines between soldiers and the world they left behind. In 1915 alone, thousands of letters were sent from the front lines, many of them carrying something more than just words. Some were filled with hope, others with quiet acceptance, and some were never meant to be read unless the worst had already happened. These weren't just updates about the war. They were confessions, final thoughts, goodbyes written in advance. Many soldiers followed an unspoken pattern. They reassured their families even when they were terrified. They spoke about home even as they were surrounded by destruction. And sometimes they prepared the people they loved for a future without them. One soldier wrote to his mother, trying to comfort her, saying he was quite safe even as battles raged around him. Another carefully explained what should happen to his belongings if he didn't return. These letters weren't dramatic. They weren't written for history. They were human, simple, honest. And that's what makes them so powerful. Because behind every uniform, there was someone thinking about home, about family, about the life they might never see again. But here's the question. What did soldiers really write when they believed it might be their last chance? What did they choose to say when they had nothing left to hide? And what do those letters reveal about fear, courage, and the reality of war? In the next part, we're going to read them.
Long before the World Wars, a man sat down to write what he believed would be his final words. His name was Sullivan Ballou, a husband, a father, a soldier. In July of 1861, during the American Civil War, he wrote a letter to his wife, Sarah, knowing he was about to face a battle that he might not survive. There was no drama in his writing, no attempt to sound heroic, only honesty, only love. He told her that if he did not return, she should remember how deeply he loved her, that his last thoughts would be of her, and that even in death his love would remain. Days later, he was killed in the First Battle of Bull Run. The letter survived. He did not. More than 50 years later, a different war would consume the world, and millions of soldiers would find themselves doing the exact same thing, writing letters, not knowing if they would ever return. During World War I, the scale of death was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Young men were sent into trenches where survival itself felt like an illusion. Mud swallowed their boots. Rain never seemed to stop. Artillery turned the earth into something unrecognizable, and every time they were ordered to go over the top, they knew the truth. Many of them wouldn't come back. So they wrote, not once, not casually, but with intention, with weight, because these letters might be the last piece of them the world would ever see. Some of them began simply, "My dear mother, my beloved wife, to my dearest." But behind those words there was something deeper, something unspoken. Many soldiers followed a pattern, not because they were told to, but because somehow they all understood what needed to be said. First, reassurance. They would say they were fine, that the conditions were manageable, that the war was not as bad as people imagined, even when none of it was true. Even when they were cold, exhausted, terrified, they chose to protect the people they loved by hiding the truth. Then, memory. They would talk about home, about simple things, a warm meal, a quiet morning, the sound of laughter, details that seemed small until they were taken away, because in the middle of chaos, memory became a form of escape. Then, love, repeated over and over again, not just once, not just casually, but urgently, as if saying it multiple times could somehow make it last longer, as if those words might need to carry on without them. And finally, something else, something subtle, a preparation, not always direct, not always obvious, but present. They would mention what should happen to their belongings. They would give instructions. They would say things like, "If anything should happen," or "In case I do not return." They never said it outright, but they understood, and so did the people reading those letters. World War II came, and the pattern didn't change. Different uniforms, different battlefields, same human instinct. Across Europe, across the Pacific, men once again found themselves writing letters in moments of uncertainty. On ships crossing vast oceans, in foxholes under constant threat, before missions they knew were dangerous, before battles they weren't expected to survive. Some wrote quickly, rushed, as if time itself was running out. Others wrote slowly, carefully choosing each word, as if trying to capture everything that mattered in a single page. Some of them wrote letters they never sent. They kept them folded, close to their hearts, in their pockets, because sending it meant admitting something they weren't ready to accept, that it might be the end. There were others who gave their letters to friends with simple instructions. "If I don't make it, send this." A quiet agreement, a shared understanding between men who didn't need to say much because they were all thinking the same thing. And then there were the letters that arrived, days later, weeks later, stamped, delivered, opened by hands that were hoping for good news, only to realize they were reading a goodbye. A mother reading words her son had written before he died. A wife holding a letter that was never meant to reach her so soon. A family realizing that the voice on the page was the last one they would ever hear. These letters weren't written for history. They weren't written to be remembered. They were written because someone needed to say something before it was too late. And yet, they survived. Thousands of them, preserved in archives, stored away, quietly holding the final thoughts of people who never came back. When you read them, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Different countries, different wars, different languages, but the same emotions, the same fears, the same love. They didn't write about strategy. They didn't write about victory. They wrote about home, about family, about the life they wished they could return to. Because in the end, war strips everything away. Rank, pride, illusion, and what remains is something deeply human. A need to be remembered, a need to say goodbye, a need to leave something behind. But here's what makes it even more powerful. Many of these men didn't know for certain that they would die. They weren't prophets. They weren't predicting the future. They were simply aware that the next moment could be their last. And that awareness changed the way they wrote. Every word mattered. Every sentence carried weight because there was no guarantee of another chance. Some letters ended with hope. "I will see you soon." Others ended with uncertainty. "Pray for me." And some ended with quiet acceptance. No dramatic final lines, no grand speeches, just a simple expression of love, a final connection. And then silence. For every letter that was written, there were countless stories that ended before the ink had even dried. Letters never finished, never sent, never read. So, what do these letters really tell us? Not about war, not about victory, but about people. They show us that even in the darkest moments, human beings hold on to the same things: love, memory, connection. That even when surrounded by death, they think about life. And that when faced with the possibility of losing everything, they choose to leave something behind. A message, a feeling, a piece of themselves. Because in the end, that's all a letter really is. Not paper, not ink, but a voice. A voice that refuses to disappear, even after everything else is gone. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all. Somewhere, right now, there are still letters that have been written, but not yet read. Waiting.
And now you've heard their words, not as history, but as something closer, something human. Because these weren't just soldiers. They were sons, husbands, brothers. Men who, in their final moments of uncertainty, chose not to speak about war, but about love. From Sullivan Ballou to the millions who followed in the trenches of World War I and the battlefields of World War II, the message never changed. When everything else was taken away, they wrote about what truly mattered. And maybe that's what makes these letters so powerful. Not the fear, not the death, but the quiet realization that in the end, we all hold on to the same things. So the next time you read a letter like this, remember, you're not just reading words, you're hearing a voice that refused to disappear, a moment that refused to be forgotten, a goodbye that was never meant to be easy. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, take a moment to support the channel, like the video, subscribe, and stay for the next story, because there are many more voices still waiting to be heard.